Desert Biome by Mackenzie, Layla, Tondravi, and Dietz. This is a map of deserts around the world. They can be found near 30 degrees north and south latitude. Even though most deserts are located at those latitudes, they can also be found closer to the equator, like the Somali and Chali deserts of Africa. Background information of the desert biome. Distribution. Deserts cover about 20% of the Earth and are found in bands across the continent. Desert biomes can be found on every continent except Europe. Climate. Little to no rainfall is a primary indication that the ecosystem is part of the desert biome. Daytime temperatures of the desert are extremely hot, but they can get very cold in the nighttime hours. Organisms. Cacti are the most prevalent in the desert biome because they have adapted to the harsh environment. Their spines protect them from being eaten, and their waxy outer covering keeps water from escaping. Vegetation in the desert does not grow very tall, so low shrubs are also abundant in these climates. Shrubs and other desert plants are spaced out so that their roots can extend to find water. Because of the low vegetation, desert biomes can only accommodate small animals, rodents, and reptiles, which can escape the sun by hiding underneath the shrubs or burrowing underground. Most desert animals tend to be nocturnal and come out at night when temperatures are more tolerable.
This is a photo of the desert food web, and by following the arrows you can track the transfer of food from the producers up through the trophic levels. Common trend for the producers are that they're mostly cacti or plants that generally survive well in the desert environment. Also, common consumers in this biome are coyotes, owls, and hawks. Relationships and interactions. Competition is a symbiotic relationship between or among living things that compete for a limited resource such as food, water, or territory. An example of competition in the desert is when a jackrabbit and peccary both compete for the fruit of the prickly pear, since both animals are generally herbivorous. Predation is a form of symbiotic relationship between two organisms of unlike species in which one of them acts as a predator that captures and feeds on the other organism that serves as a prey. An example of predation in the desert is a rattlesnake eating a kangaroo rat, where the rattlesnake is a predator and the kangaroo rat is a prey. Parasitism is a form of symbiosis in which one organism, called the parasite, benefits at the expense of another organism, usually of a different species, called the host. The association may also lead to the injury of the host. An example of parasitism in the desert is a flea and a coyote. The flea benefits from this relationship by drinking the coyote's blood, but the coyote loses blood and acquires discomfort and potential disease. In this relationship, the coyote serves as the host, while the flea serves as the parasite. Mutualism is a symbiotic relationship between organisms of different species in which both individuals benefit from the association. An example of mutualism in this biome is the phainopepla, which is a bird, eats the desert mistletoe berries and benefits by gaining energy from this food. The desert mistletoe benefits by the phainopepla when it drops its seeds to the ground, letting the seed grow. Commensalism is a form of symbiosis between two organisms of different species in which one of them benefits from the association, whereas the other is largely unaffected or not significantly harmed. An example of commensalism in this biome is a Harris hawk building its nest on a saguaro cactus to protect its young. The Harris hawk gets protection and shelter, while the cactus is not significantly harmed.
Clumped pattern of dispersion. This pattern of dispersion is characterized by populations which are found in tight clusters. In between these clusters, few to no individuals are found. Species will cluster together for protection or gather around natural resources necessary for survival. Black-tailed jackrabbits are an example of this dispersal pattern because they can be found in regions where desert shrubs are abundant, which can be used for protection and a food source. Uniform pattern of dispersion. This pattern of dispersion is characterized by populations which are found to be evenly distributed about their habitat, and species have the ability to survive anywhere and spread out to use all available resources. An example of this would be the desert coyotes, which need about a square mile of territory each in order to support themselves and their young. They feed on the natural resources that are found in their specific territory. Random pattern of dispersion. This pattern of dispersion is characterized by populations which are found randomly in their habitat. In plants, this can be caused by the wind, and in animals, it can be due to unsystematic movement. An example of this would be the brittle bush seeds, which are dispersed randomly by the strong wind gusts in the Mojave Desert, but can also be picked up and dropped off randomly by the kangaroo rats and birds that feed on it. For our survivorship curve, we chose type 3, which is also known as the early loss survivorship curve, because mortality is very high in infant and juvenile stages, followed by low death rates for the few individuals that have reached adulthood. Scorpions are type 3 because after their birth, they lack an exoskeleton and are exposed to predators and their environment. They stay with their mother for about 50 days after their birth, but their mother may be their biggest predator if she cannot find enough food for herself. If they can survive predators or their mother, they may live up to 20 years.
Water is hard to come by in the desert, making the success of the water cycle consequential in sustaining the biome. To begin, water enters the atmosphere through transpiration from plants and evaporation from larger bodies of water. In the desert, most of the water will enter the atmosphere through transpiration of producers like cacti because there are few large bodies of water in the desert that are available to evaporate. The little bit of water that does undergo evaporation will then go through condensation to create clouds that will eventually precipitate and send H2O back to the ground. In deserts, underground water is the major supplier of the rest of the water cycle. Groundwater and runoff are major provisions in terms of water that re-enters the atmosphere as well as water that gives nutrients to the producers in the biome. It is important to also recognize that many deserts experience periods of flash flooding, which is another major way that water comes back to the earth in the cycle. The water cycle in the desert, although limited, is important to the survival of plants and animals in the biome. With such little water available, organisms must adapt to the environment and work around the fact that much of the water is underground as opposed to easily accessible on the surface. The carbon cycle follows the flow of CO2 through the atmosphere into the organisms on Earth. The process begins when carbon exits the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Photosynthetic organisms like cacti undergo photosynthesis and take in carbon. Other organisms then consume the producers and take up that CO2. The last organisms involved are decomposers who break down dead animal matter, including the carbon in their systems. Carbon will then re-enter the atmosphere through cellular respiration of living organisms or combustion from urbanized desert areas. The carbon cycle is immensely important to the success of the desert biome because carbon molecules are the basis of all organic molecules, therefore making CO2 a necessary factor in the survival of producers and consumers alike. The nitrogen cycle starts when desert plants take up nitrate and ammonium from the sand or soil through assimilation. The process continues as primary and secondary organisms eat these producers and take up the nitrogen nutrients. By the time larger organisms like hawks and coyotes die, decomposers are able to submit these nitrates to the ground where bacteria fix the inorganic nitrates into organic molecules. Animals can only use the organic form of nitrogen. Amino acids are an example. N2 will then re-enter the atmosphere through denitrification. Nitrogen is part of many biological molecules, making it essential to the survival and growth of different organisms. Plants in the desert can take up inorganic nitrogen molecules to help them grow, and these molecules will eventually be transported to larger consumers and help them thrive as well. The phosphorus cycle begins when the weathering of rocks in the desert add phosphate to the soil. With severe winds as well as consistent flash flooding, erosion is a common occurrence. Apatite, a mineral present in rocks, contains the phosphate that is eventually released. This phosphate will then seep into the abundant groundwater in the desert. Producers above ground integrate the phosphate from the soil into their biological molecules. This can be seen in phosphodiester bonds as well as the phosphate backbone of DNA. Animals will then eat these plants and take up the phosphorus themselves before eventually dying and undergoing decomposition. The phosphorus then enters the soil and leaches or seeps into water sources under the surface. The processes of sedimentation and geologic uplift bring the phosphorus from the soil and water back into rocks above ground for the process to repeat. The phosphorus cycle is overall extremely important to organisms in the desert because it is what gives them their biological molecules, or the foundation of their lives. Deserts are being the most severely affected by growing populations and constant urbanization. Although the desert biome is not an ideal place to settle, nor is it very habitable at first glance, the rate at which the human population is growing is forcing people to live in these areas and make do with what is available to them, despite the dangerous effects that come along with it. In general, desert ecosystems have been hurt through the addition of irrigation in the ground in order to transport water long distances, as well as the addition of groundwater wells that have more short-term effects on the immediate area around the city or town in question. In addition to this, people introduce non-native species into the desert, leading to a loss of biodiversity. One modern example of humans disturbing the desert environment can be seen in Las Vegas. This popular city is built directly on the Mojave Desert, a place that was not populated nor livable years ago. The city will take water from elsewhere and transport it in underground supplies to hundreds of hotels and casinos with fresh water in seconds. They also take fiber optic cables and send them throughout the desert to connect other cities and towns nearby. Overall, this destroys the landscape and hurts the environment severely, to the point where what was once a desert is now a luscious city that defies the rules of the environment as a whole.